We're here with Marcus Rediker, who is a professor of history at the University of Pittsburgh and someone that I've known for a long, long time. You've read Marcus's article for this week, and I'd like to start off by asking Professor Rediker to talk a little bit about this concept of a two-stage transition from feudalism to capitalism. Marcus?
Yes, Rick, thank you. The rise of capitalism has frequently been treated as a process basically of industrialization that begins in the early 19th century and comes forward to the present. But in my view, we really need to understand an earlier part of the same process. This has been called the era of primitive accumulation. This is one in which the European empires led by England create colonies, they create a plantation system worldwide, and they mobilize labor on a vast and unprecedented scale, both enslaved labor and free labor. This is really the origins of Atlantic capitalism, and without understanding this, in my view, it's impossible to understand the industrial phase that follows it.
Okay, thanks. Let me follow up with a second question, and the students that have carefully read the article won't be surprised by this one. You talk about a detour out of free labor back into unfree status for many of the common people who made their way across the Atlantic to those New World colonies that you just mentioned. Could you elaborate a bit upon that detour?
Well, we need to begin by understanding that capitalism really began first in England. It began there in the late 16th century, and this involved freeing people from often feudal estates, and many of them moving into the realm of wage labor. So this is the historical trajectory in England, and I would also say in Europe. What happens when these European empires colonize the New World is that they basically resort to older forms of unfree labor. Now, this is not exactly the same as slavery in the classical world, nor even the same as feudalism in Europe, because one of the things that's going to happen with the rise of a plantation system in the Americas, and I mean North America, the Caribbean, Brazil, is that you're going to get a new kind of slavery in which many people are reattached to the mode of production in order to produce for the world market. So this is a very important thing about this detour. It revives and greatly expands forms of unfree labor, but it links them very closely to this worldwide system of production called capitalism.
Great, thanks. And Marcus, just one final question for you. I know some of the students who are really keen on this topic are going to want to follow up and possibly do some additional reading. There's a book review assignment. Could you talk just briefly about some of your book-length projects that they might seek out for themselves?
Sure. My first book was called Between the Devil and the Deep Blue Sea, Merchant Seamen, Pirates, and the Anglo-American Maritime World, 1700 to 1750. And this is basically a book about the sailor as essentially the first modern worker, and sailors as a cutting edge of the first modern working class within the rise of capitalism. So that, I think, is a book that might be of interest to some. A second is a book that I wrote with Peter Linebaugh called The Many-Headed Hydra, Sailors, Slaves, Commoners, and the Hidden History of the Revolutionary Atlantic. This is really a big study over a couple of centuries of the process of transforming labor into a commodity all around the Atlantic, and the many-sided and fierce resistance to that process from below. So that's really about a very long stream of revolts, from naval mutinies to slave revolts to urban riots. That's really an account of the rise of the modern working class in a transnational way. And then some students might be interested in pirates. I wrote a book on pirates called Villains of All Nations, Atlantic Pirates in the Golden Age. And it turns out pirates play a particularly important part in all this because they actually break free and attack capitalist shipping. Pirate ships are basically self-organized by workers, by sailors, And how they organized their ships is very interesting. They did so democratically. They divided their loot in an egalitarian way. They posed a very serious challenge to capitalism, and they were annihilated for it, hanged by the hundreds. And then finally, I'll mention a book called The Slave Ship, A Human History. This is a book about the slave trade from 1700 to around 1808. It's really a story of how rulers in Europe created labor power on a massive scale to fuel the plantations of the New World. What happened on board those slave ships is really horrific, but there is a redeeming quality to that story, and that is that the people on those ships, the enslaved Africans, fought back in every way imaginable. And to my mind, that's a very essential part of the story.
Great. Thank you very much.